Welcome to Future Left Podcast. I'm Adam Simpson, here as always with my co-host Casey Rogers. How you doing today, Casey?
I'm pretty good, man. You doing all right?
I'm doing all right. I'm very psyched. We have some guests today. We have Mr. Michael Johnston and Matt Bolton of the Robot Overlordz podcast. Welcome to the show today, guys. How are you guys doing today?
Good, thank you.
It's great to have you. That we're appropriately occasion we're going to be talking about some of the feedback we got from our questionnaire, which Mike was good enough to participate in. Happy to have his views in the question and answer, and as well as on the program today. You can check out Robot Overlordz on iTunes, Stitcher is where their podcast is, and you can also check them out at robotoverlords.fm. And of course, Future Left, you can get all of our stuff at futureleft.org, Facebook, Twitter. We have the Patreon page now. We also have, of course, our Ask the Robot Question petition on change.org, which we encourage you all to sign if you haven't already. But with that, I think I want to turn to Mike and Matt and just ask them to kind of introduce themselves, tell our audience more about the Robot Overlords in their own words.
Okay. So I'm Mike Johnston, and I guess I kind of started the process of organizing us, but Matt and I have been longtime friends, and started doing Robot Overlords as a podcast really regularly beginning in January of 2014. And we are just about to release, I think, our 300th episode. And
wow.
So, it's getting up there now.
I think this will be episode 29. So you're a bit ahead of us, I have to say.
Yeah, a little bit.
I have to say. No, similarly, I dragged Casey into this, so there's a little bit
bound by friendship, which is a blessing and a burden.
But with that, I just want to tell everyone about what we did this week. We have the Ask the Robot question, which is trying to get debate moderators to ask presidential candidates about workforce automation at the 2016 presidential debate. And one effort we did to kind of promote this initiative is to reach out to a number of experts and with a series of questions. And the experts that were good enough to comment on them were Garl Perovitz, co-chair of the Next System Project and co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative; Callum Chase, author of The Economic Singularity; Robin Hanson, author of Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth; Mike Johnston, as we already said, co-host of the Robot Overlords podcast; Scott Santons. If you've read anything about basic income, you've probably come across Scott Santons once or twice, writer and basic income advocate; Katie Sipp, editor of the Hack the Union blog; and then Alex Williams, author of Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism, and a World Without Work, author with Nick Cernak, I should say. And then we also have received comment from the United Steelworkers, one of America's biggest unions. So with that, I want to get right into the questions. The first question being, why is 2016 the time to talk about workforce automation? Haven't people been concerned about technological unemployment for centuries? And I think this is the interesting thing because I don't know about you guys, but every time I tell someone that I really like reading about robots taking jobs, they kind of scratch their head and kind of want to move away to someone else at this bar that I've approached them in. So
it gets pepper sprayed a lot.
Yeah, I do. My eyes are growing resistant to that process, though.
Not a good
thing. We don't have to talk about that, though. Gentlemen, why is 2016 the time that we should be talking about robots at the presidential debate? And of course, you're free to disagree with that, what some of our commenters did.
I think it's a good time to at least start the conversation. I mean, I think 2016 is really the year where you're going to start seeing it in a lot bigger ways. I mean, you mentioned both Scott and Callum had replied to you guys on the questionnaire. We've had both of them on. I highly recommend Callum's book as a sort of a primer to the history of some of this idea and, why now is different. I think that if you look at self-driving cars where they're at, it's much easier to have this discussion before there's actually massive amounts of people laid off. I mean, in the conversations, Matt and I have had about technological unemployment, which is what we tend to call the robot question. We've talked a lot about how an awful lot of people in the U.S. anyway are truck drivers and how that's going to play out. If you suddenly had all truck drivers just unemployed or, down to a fraction of their current employment, that would be a pretty major economic hit.
Millions of jobs.
Absolutely.
And one thing that's interesting to me is we are really off to the races in the self-driving car market. You've got Ford and Uber is now is putting self-driving cars into Pittsburgh, and I'm sure they want to do this everywhere and kind of avoid the questionable, to me, questionable practice of the independent contractor model. Just avoid that problem altogether with self-driving cars. But it seems like that's going to be the big one of the next. I would say certainly the next 4 years is the self-driving car question.
Even if it takes a couple more years to really be a massive question for people, I think it's worth it to start the discussion now. Even if you think it's going to be another 100 years, why not start having the conversation now? I mean, Matt and I were talking about this a little bit before we joined you guys. I think there's a lot of things that, regardless of whether this ever comes off, you would do anyway. You can get some real easy wins that way. Plus, there's some things that maybe you wouldn't think of unless this came up as a question that you do whether or not it ever does also. So, there's a lot of good, wins out of the conversation just by virtue of having it.
Well, that's what me and Adam have thought, but we're constantly surprised since we've had this robot question idea out there about the amount of resistance that we get of people saying that we're saying the sky is falling and that we're being sort of Luddite and anti-progress and just by wanting to ask the question. A lot of people seem offended by the very idea that we would want to ask the question. They either think that automation is either so obviously a good and or inevitable thing that it doesn't matter to ask the question, or that it's obviously such a horrible thing that we need to avoid at all costs, so we don't need to ask the question. But people seem to be very, very touchy about wanting to talk about this for some reason.
I don't understand why you would be, is because if this, let's say this just never happens, then what are you out? I mean, you're not out anything, but
right.
Exactly.
By starting the conversation, you're at least, you don't want to, nobody wants to wake up all of a sudden and realize, every truck driver just got fired or every taxi driver just got fired, and,
Right.
Absolutely. What's going to happen is a lot easier question than what's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a better vantage point.
Yeah, or, hey, it's already happened, let's try and fix it. Why don't we try and fix it before it all falls apart?
What happened is a pretty, that's a tragic question. Well, what already happened?
Yeah. And it's interesting, just two quick points. I actually had to Casey's point, a friend of mine say, kind of refer to this initiative as fear-mongering. And I was like, no, it's not fear. I hope robots take our jobs.
Sure.
I think that's a nice idea that we can all pursue passion rather than pursue rent, frankly. And Mike, I think I've heard that you mentioned this as well, but it's something I strongly identify with. Is that, I think of this sort of like climate change. Like, why would the worst case scenario, we end up with cleaner air, right? So why not try to start implementing these types of these steps toward climate change, I think.
Well, to your point, I think this touches on a lot of areas that make people uncomfortable. It touches on how we value work, what the role of different people in society is. And it's scary. I mean, because no one wants to lose their job. We have so many ideas in a person's worth tied up in work. I mean, Matt could tell you, I tried to do a startup a couple years ago myself and failed utterly at it. And, in that experience, there was a moment in 2011 where I was down to my last $80 in the bank. I mean, literally, I had $80. And the stress and the fear when I was checking the ATM and saw that $80, and my rent at the time was $1,600. So, and just I got the shakes and it over my entire body. Nobody wants to go through that. And so there's we've got a lot of resistance, a lot of cultural issues that this touches on. It makes people uncomfortable, but that gets back to why I think it's important to start the conversation.
Right. Yeah. It seems to me that the most palpable resistance to this comes from the way that our culture ties up identity with career and job. And, there's a lot of people that identify and their entire identity is built on what they do for a living. You say, tell me about yourself. And the first thing they say is, I do X, I do Y.
Yeah.
I would say that's very prevalent. Who doesn't do that? I mean, it's just expected.
In DC, I'll say everyone has this conception that everyone talks about their jobs here. People are so full of themselves. But in my mind, I spend like 8 hours a day on a job. It's half of my waking life, a third of, if we count sleep as part of my life. So it would be weird if I never talked about my job. I felt like.
Right. No, I agree. As a teacher, I love telling people about how important I am to our society, and that's that's a big thing for me.
Yeah. Thank you for your service, by the way.
Thank you. Wow.
So the question 2 is what we've heard concerns about jobs lost to free trade agreements and immigration during this campaign. We don't have to. We can critique that more if we want. But should candidates be more or less concerned about jobs lost to automation? I'll kick that to you two first.
Well, I would be more worried about free trade, losing jobs to free trade. One of the other things, and you guys, and I'm sure I'll get resistance from all three of you on it. And I don't care. I think one of the things that will speed up technological unemployment and bring about is the push to raise the minimum wage to $15 or higher.
Right.
Places like, you see ma and pop places, small hamburger stands or whatever, they're probably either going to go out of business or the prices are going to go up or whatever. McDonald's and those kind of places, Walmart, they'll be able to absorb that by, figuring out, or they always figure out an accounting way. But sure. McDonald's is already, you see the self-ordering kiosks. You're going to be able to order your entire thing on phone, so you don't need somebody at the drive-thru. McDonald's has been working on a thing to automate the process of actually making the burger. So, you're eliminating a lot of staff that way, and I think it'll only get worse.
Right. I think that's certainly true because, I think you're right, and even a lot of executives have said that. I will say that in question 3, which is more about labor organization, Katie Sipp actually touched on this. She said that this has kind of always been the line about raising the minimum wage, is that it would lead to automation, and but that, I don't know. In my mind, I feel like McDonald's would probably automate whenever they're able, regardless. I suppose it might speed it along, but I don't know. I feel like cutting out their labor costs down to an iPad would be ideal no matter what the minimum wage is.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine McDonald's being pushed into anything, really. They really are able to wield any sort of plans whenever they want to, however they want to. It's hard to imagine them having their hand forced.
I do think it's certainly true of mom and pop shops. That could be more difficult.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Suggest.
Well, my point is, I think it will speed the process up quite a bit. If McDonald's is faced with, right now they're paying, a high school kid, $6, $7, whatever the minimum wage is, I don't know, but, and all of a sudden you're doubling or tripling that, they're going to, I'm assuming a lot of money will start flooding into research on how do we eliminate more and more employees. The last thing I read was that if the minimum wage goes nationally to $15 an hour, it'll mean the loss of between 7 and 9 million jobs.
I think that, I don't know, because it's the same thing with like the argument for why automation won't kill jobs, and I normally push back on this, but I think it's kind of the same line of economic thinking, is that it will produce so much wealth. It's honestly kind of a trickle down argument, that it will create more demand, and that will create more jobs. Similarly, if we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, consumers will have more purchasing powers, which will raise demand, and that will create more jobs. I guess it's a little bit different with the minimum wage, because rather than a trickle down, it's like it's kind of like basic income. Everybody gets more and demand goes up.
I think my resistance to the idea is that I don't see it as being a necessary outcome of raising minimum wage. I see it more as a threat that corporations sort of wield over the heads of their employees, saying, if you keep pushing for this, we're just going to get rid of you all. And that seems to be a bargaining tool more than it is an actual chain of causation.
Yeah. I will say.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Mike, your answer is something that you pointed to Martin Ford, and I think Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson have also mentioned this, that free trade agreements and jobs being displaced abroad are kind of like a staging ground for the effects of automation.
Yes. I do think they're all tied together. They're all related. I think they go back to why this is a good idea and good time to have these kinds of debates and things like that. I think it touches on, how we value labor and the workers. The fact that we have people at the bottom and then you look at what the people at the top do. I mean, I've worked for a big company. You know, I worked for AT&T for 11 years almost. And to be honest, the CEO doesn't seem to do that much. You know, why is he getting paid millions of dollars? And we're having this discussion at the bottom. I kind of feel like they have us all focused on each other in the middle and at the bottom, so that we don't look up at the top and be like, well,
divide and conquer.
What about that? You know,
divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Mike, you sound like a dirty communist rat.
No, I'm all for paying people to their skills. You know, I'm all about the meritocracy. But
no, I agree.
I think you need a floor and I think you need a ceiling, and they need to move over time.
Okay.
I mean, some of the issues I think that Matt and I see out in the world that have problems. I mean, you take, like, for example, Social Security. When they designed that system, it was designed as just a flat, you know, you're 65 and you're in. They didn't design it with any kind of feedback loops to society. You know, if say the transhumanists are right and suddenly we're all living to 400, if everyone gets to retire at 65, that system is going to crumble well before it gets there. You know, it needs to be tied together.
Well, by the time we get to 400 years of life, I'm sure we'll have replicators and we can just tea Earl Grey hot. We'll all be fine.
Whoa, Star Trek references.
I just think you need to take those systems and you need to design feedback loops into them. I mean, you know, to Matt's point about the minimum wage, I personally think the minimum wage is a horrible mechanism for ensuring a floor, because it cuts out all the people that don't have jobs. It's really hard to discuss raising it. You know, there's all this garbage. And, you know, again, you can point at companies that'll threaten to, well, if you raise this, we're just going to get rid of the jobs.
Right.
It's a terrible mechanism. But this is why, to me, the whole robot question is such a great lens to view this discussion on, because we can ask the question, well, then what would be a good way to do this? What would be a good way to set the floor?
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned kind of controlling the ceiling as well, because I've been seeing this kind of meme going around about a maximum wage as opposed to a minimum wage. And it's actually been like there's like a video in it, but it's of like Jesse Ventura talking about the maximum wage. And I haven't clicked on it because like I'm like, I don't want to know what Jesse Ventura thinks. But it's interesting because it seems like it's an idea that I've find a lot of friends who aren't just, you know, dirty liberals like myself or dirty lefties that are sharing this idea about a maximum wage. So it's interesting, raising the floor and lowering the ceiling.
Well, I'm not for an absolute floor or ceiling. You know, I don't think we should set it at you get $1,000 a month and you can get as much as $1 million a month. You know, I think that's a stupid idea, because it, you know, you're going to get inflation. It's going to change over time. It needs to be linked to something. I mean, I don't necessarily know what that is. I'm sure there's smart people that could figure it out, but when you're
there
designing,
needs to be something to make the system more dynamic. I mean, you're right, and that, like you mentioned, that's the problem with a lot of our social programs is that they were implemented. You know, they you know, the people who implemented them say they are to solve this social ill, whether that's actually the idea behind them or not. But then they often get wielded in another direction, and they're often implemented in a very short-sighted way. And you're absolutely right. They need to be tied to something that helps them be more dynamic over time.
Well, and they become self-perpetuating. I mean, you look at something like, you know, self-driving cars. That could solve drunk driving, but it would also get rid of all the revenue for tickets. It would reduce the need for cops. It would get rid of the whole purpose of MAD. You know, I mean, what would MAD's purpose be except to prevent people from drinking? At which case, they're the 21st century version of teetotalers. And, you know, it just touches on so many different areas. You know, I think when you're designing a system, you should design it to be relatively resilient and to be able to change over time, and to not get in the way of actually solving the problem that it's meant to solve.
Right, but to be honest with you, I'm not exactly concerned with implementing things with the preservation of MAD.
Maybe they'll turn into mothers for really good self-driving car code, or so. It's an unwieldy acronym, granted.
Mothers against the trolley problem.
Yeah.
Monorails.
No, moving along, we to the third question was about basically should organized labor be concerned about automation? Because in my mind, this kind of completely shifts the paradigm of like labor bargaining for whether it's higher pay or benefits or workplace safety or things like this. No robot is going to refuse the job, barring hard hats or something like that. not that we're there that robots would be requesting hard hats, but as we just mentioned, this is often a counter argument about worker demands. And that was mentioned by Katie Sipp as well as Gar Alperovitz. And Callum Chase actually said that labor unions will probably resist it. Trade unions, I think he said specifically. But and then we also got a response from the United Steelworkers, who said, and I think to Matt's credit, he actually pointed out that he was more concerned about trade. They said by far the biggest immediate threat to United Steelworkers jobs is security and unfair trade, and they mentioned that if the U.S. doesn't take stops to prevent jobs from going to China, there's not going to be any jobs for robots to take. So,
well, I wouldn't be just as concerned about China either. I mean, you look at Mike and I have talked almost ad nauseum about the TPP.
Yeah.
You know, if the TPP passes, then you're looking at, you know, you've got countries like Vietnam, you know, Laos, some of these smaller countries where, you know, making $10 a day is actually a decent wage. So, you know, why? And you can import this stuff to the United States for free. So why on earth would I pay somebody $15 an hour if it's a union job? It's probably, you know, $40 an hour plus 30 supervisors to do that job. Why would I do that when I can pay some kid $10 a day to do the exact same work?
Right. Well, I guess the problem with the trade thing to me is, as a dirty lefty, I have a lot of problems with trade because of you know, typically when we think about trade and developing countries playing a bigger role in the supply chain, it normally comes down to the issue of you know, children doing the work without proper safety or without a livable wage, or even if they're getting $10 a day, and that's pretty good for the area. It's really not a way to. It's really not the way that most countries develop and industrialize, because a lot of the wealth that the surplus value, as Marx would put it, goes out of the country to the owners over here in the United States or in Europe or wherever the rich guy is. So I feel like I've just deliberately caused a distraction. Now I'm wondering how to back away from it. But no, I mean the trade issue. Yeah, I don't know. I felt like it was kind of, I don't know, because there are labor unions that have made comments, and labor organizers like Katie Sipp, who have pointed out stuff about automation and self-driving cars, and people like her have been active in looking at Uber's business practices. And as it goes into automation, I don't know, I guess I would expect a little more solidarity with people who are concerned about automation versus people that are just concerned about trade. Just to bring back the thing I started with, do you think that automation I think ultimately it does. So that might be a silly question. How in your mind does it change the labor management paradigm? Is that going to change going to happen soon? Or is that something that labor leaders shouldn't immediately be concerned about? Because there is an Uber driver union, but it doesn't have much power, so it's not much of an issue. So is that something labor leaders should be more concerned with?
If I was a labor leader, I would be very concerned with it. I mean, you've seen the decline of labor unions over the years. Anyhow, that, you know, at least the membership numbers have plummeted over the years. And, you know, if you have the ability to automate something, that's just going to increase decrease the number of people who are in the unions, because you'll be replacing them with automated jobs, you know. And once you get to a point where the labor unions are small enough that, you know, you can just say as management or whatever, you can just say, hey, you know what, we don't need you guys anymore. And so if I was management, or if I was a union leader, I would be very concerned with it, but that's just me.
To me, I would say everyone in the job market should be concerned with it in a way, because individually, you know, look at what most of us have to offer, and it really is our labor. You know, in those terms, none of us, for the most part, in the middle class, you know, you maybe have your home, you maybe have a few stocks, but you can't live off that. You basically live off your labor for most of us. And, you know, if you're talking about suddenly being able to automate that labor where your labor isn't needed, you know, what are you offering? And that's where I think that our current systems and a lot of our terminology, a lot of our myths about the way our systems work even get in our way of thinking about this.
Absolutely.
You know, of what do you have to offer the economy? And this is why I guess I personally am really kind of obsessed with the idea of Kickstarters and, you know, people doing things creatively, people sharing things that their friends do. And what I find is that there's not yet a lot of general consciousness about this. You know, I mean, Matt and I have been doing our podcast now for 2.5 years. I'm sure you guys find this too. When you talk to your friends about what you're doing, a lot of them, oh, that's nice, and they kind of move on, you know. Yeah. And yet they have no problem sharing the latest BuzzFeed article, you know, about 10 ways to shampoo your dog. Or some garbage like that.
I see it a lot when I talk to people about affordable college. They'll often say, "Oh, well, you just have people being music majors and art majors, as if art and music are completely worthless. That's the last thing we want. We want people going out there making money in business." And so, yeah, there are a lot of heavily symbolic things like that where people see value only in a very small amount of things.
Yeah, I'd just like to see that widen out. You know, I did a post on our site that I called the Robot War about, and really my end idea was that, you know, that the whole idea of the robot question offers us the chance to treat each other as full humans, as creatives, as all kinds of different things. And yet, you know, that's going to take a major culture shift, you know, because everyone wants to pay attention to the superstars. No one wants to share what their friends are doing. So to me, the way you start spreading the access to these kinds of things and these ideas around as you talk about them, you start sharing what your friends are doing, and you know, just realize how much like what you have to offer in the economy is connected to what everyone around you has to offer.
That's interesting, because me and Adam always talk about how legislation is only one part of the equation. You have to change our cultural mindset about these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, and when it comes to that, Casey, I often find, you know, politicians, they'll often say like, you know, there's just no public mood for it. And to me, that always says to me, I'm back away from any responsibility for leadership. Yeah. Because I feel like politicians, if they want to, they could probably convince a lot of the population about virtually anything. I'm not saying that's good.
Well, because the public mood often has a lot to do with where is the conversation, the national conversation going, and politicians often set that.
Yeah. But to your point, Mike, I think Scott Santons noted that labor should think of this as a danger and also consider UBI, or the Universal Basic Income, as a way of escaping increasingly coercive labor markets. And I think that I don't know. I guess as I recall from your podcast, you're somewhat supportive of basic income, because I can't recall. How does that grab you about basic income and coercive labor markets? Do you buy that?
I guess I really kind of like the idea. I mean, in terms of how to pay for it, things like that, I'm a little bit more open. You know, of the two of us, Matt's a little bit less keen on the idea. You know, I mean, to me, I think one of the best ways maybe to fund it is I'm kind of death on the high frequency trading algorithms, which I feel like are just, if AI is going to develop and it's going to be, you know, the Terminator scenario, it will probably develop there. And, you know, if you put a 0.0000001% tax on stock trades, you could fund an awful lot of potentially a UBI just by the value extraction that those things do. And it's practically unnoticeable to people. You know, in a way that's sort of the blessed version of magic conjuring money, basically. And I would like to see those things work in a little bit more responsible way to society rather than the way they currently seem to work, which is, you know, they suck up all the value and leave the rest of us high and dry. So, you know, I'm not that attached to only that. I mean, I think there's a number of other ways you could do this. I think that it sounds to a lot of people like a bad idea because, you know, you're just giving money to people. But I guess I would relate it to, you know, in like California, they're building up and tearing down houses, and yet they have homeless people. And at a certain point, you're spending more money on managing your homeless and meanwhile building up and tearing down these houses than you would just spend if you just gave people houses already. I mean, you know, we have a lot of problems like that I think our attitudes get in the way of considering how it could work. And, you know, admittedly, there's criticisms to make of that maybe, but I think that too often it's just sort of a knee-jerk, oh, we can't do that.
You're right. It is weird to talk about, you know, how much social programs are going to cost when there's already so much waste. like you mentioned, that if we were able to tighten up some of those systems and reduce waste, then maybe people wouldn't really feel any sort of strain if there was a basic income that came out of that. That's a good point.
Yeah. I think the next question was about about did they foresee any disruptions as a result of automation within the next presidential administration, potentially from 2017 to 2025, if it gets 8 years, if the next president gets 8 years. I think we already kind of covered that in question one. We talked about self-driving cars. The only thing I wanted to touch on is I do think that with the amount of money and capital and venture capital specifically going into artificial intelligence, I suspect we'll see a lot more developments in that field, impacting more jobs like the job that I normally have, which is basically a program assistant at a think tank doing kind of event planning and stuff like that. I feel like a lot of the tasks of that job, if not the entire job, could probably be automated down by AI to the point where you probably wouldn't need as many program assistants and administrative backstopping, that kind of thing. So I guess I wanted to give you guys a chance to just tackle do you think the AI, we're going to see more impact from AI within the next 8 years, or is that a little too optimistic?
I think that gets to the whole difference between, linear things, the way that people expect, and exponential. When we were talking, I think exponential thinking, I want to say it was with Callum Chase, where, if you took a step and then you doubled it, and then you doubled it, and you doubled it, by like the 30th step, you would go to the moon. Actually, the 30th step would bring you back from the moon, because your 29th step would be what took you to the moon. And basically up until you get to almost the second to last step, I feel like a lot with AI, it looks kind of ridiculous. It looks silly. I mean, you look at the DARPA Grand Challenge when they were testing self-driving cars. The first year, no car made it more than 2 miles into a 50-mile course. And the next year, 6 cars finished, or some high number of that. And they had doubled the course. Yeah. And then the next year they drove in traffic in a city. It's just that level of improvement. I don't think people expect it. And so, if you talk, Uber is testing self-driving cars in Pittsburgh, this year or maybe into next year. In 8 years, you could have a personal drone that flies you everywhere, summoned by an app on your phone. I mean, who knows where we're going to be?
I think our global disappointment over the lack of flying cars that we were told in the past we would have today has made everyone think that these sort of technologies are sort of science fiction, that it's impractical to talk about. But if you look, you're absolutely right that if you look at the exponential progress that's been made just recently, just over the last few years, it's a lot more real of an outcome than people currently think. But I think the whole science fiction, it's seeming science fiction-y, is what prevents a lot of people from getting involved in the conversation.
Well, and we're used to the past, if you went back in time to right before the Wright brothers flew, and you told everybody, oh, we're going to have jet planes, they'd look at you like you were fucking nuts. I mean, seriously, they think you were crazy. You'd get locked up and drugged and probably lobotomized, but
good old
you'd be right. You would totally be right. And we're looking at it from, the perspective of the people, and comparatively, the people around the Wright brothers' time who were, no one will ever fly. Look at all the attempts that have been made. They totally suck, and yet we were on the cusp of it and we just didn't see it. And not to say that it necessarily will happen in a year or 5 years or 8 years even. Maybe it's 30 or 40 years away. But I would not bet on that. Look at how fast Google's, what is it, Go program, or I always mess up the name of that one, but
deep. Oh yeah, the
Go program.
Okay, yeah, Deep Mind, that played Go and won. Yeah.
Yeah, and they said that wouldn't happen for another like 20 years.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Wright brothers. Their first flight was in 1903, and we were on the moon like 60 years later. And if you think, a little more than that, but if you think about, like, we had been stuck to the ground. We were enjoying the oceans quite a bit by then, but that leap in that short amount of time with respect to human history, I mean, it's incredible.
Well, I always love reading accounts from the late 19th century of people saying, we've done all the developing we're going to do as a human race. Like, this is it. We're not going to progress past this. And it's so mind-blowing to think about how little they had. They didn't have the Kardashians, guys.
Who was it that said the
no,
world only needs 5 computers?
Oh Lord.
I think the head of IBM.
Who is the enemy of computers?
So the fifth question was about. Let me scroll down here. What policy responses would you most like to see a candidate suggest as a response to automation? So there were a lot of people that mentioned basic income. Scott Stanton mentioned basic income. Garl Paravitz, Alex Williams mentioned basic income. Robin Hanson mentioned global insurance against large bursts of automation. But Mike, I think your response about global corruption, I think, gets to the heart of the basic income issue, because if you think about it, if like let's say Lithuania implements the basic income, I get a feeling a lot of other people around the neighborhood would suddenly want to go to Lithuania. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and it's kind of a
I'm kidding. I'm sorry.
It's kind of a similar effect of what were we talking about before? I don't know, the people hiding taxes overseas. So like we all know that Apple is based in California, like all the other people, like all the other Silicon Valley folks, but they're headquartered in air quotes in Ireland, right? That's where they hide most of their tax money.
Yep.
So it's a similar issue, I think.
Well, and my response was really, I guess where I really landed on that was when we were talking with Callum again. You know, I mean, a lot of the discussion we've had has been with Callum about this issue, or just between Matt and I, you know, but that anywhere that implements a basic income, you're going to have all the rich people are going to leave and all the poor people are going to come. And, you know, if you're going to control this at all, if you're going to experiment with it even, you have to kind of close the door on corporations sucking out all the wealth or moving it around and playing countries against each other. I mean, in our, you know, we were talking about McDonald's and the minimum wage already. You know, you look at how they got exceptions to Obamacare. I mean, regardless of how you feel about Obamacare, the people that probably should have gotten exceptions were, you know, like Matt mentioned earlier, the small businesses, the ones who really couldn't afford it. They're the ones that should have gotten the exceptions, and instead they get squeezed. And meanwhile, McDonald's gets exceptions like crazy. I mean, to me, that's backwards. If you're going to do any of these kind of programs, if you're even going to try them to see if they work, so you can judge it based on the data rather than, you know, us going back and forth on opinions, you really need to make sure that corporations can't game the system. And the biggest way they game it is exactly like Apple, like you mentioned, Adam. They are based in Ireland. That's a load of bullshit.
Yeah.
How dare you, sir?
When it's silly. I can't remember the. I
love Apple,
the exact
too.
number.
You know,
I do too.
I can't remember the exact number of employees that are based at their Ireland headquarters, but I know it was like laughably silly when compared to their facilities in Palo Alto or wherever they are in California.
Well, and to hear Tim Cook talk about it, $40 billion is too much to pay in taxes. Well, you know what, Tim? My tax bill is too big. You know, I'm sure your guys' tax bill is too big. I'm sure Matt's tax bill is too big. Boo-hoo, cry me a river. You guys can afford it. You know, they're operating like they're still a startup, and yet they're the biggest, wealthiest corporation in the world. To me, that's like, you know, the successful lawyer dad who's making his kids eat, you know, bread and water all day. I mean, come on,
Well, Mike, you know how, I mean, in America, there's this weird thing where the more affluent you are and the more privilege you have, you know, the lower your bar for victimization becomes. You know how this works, Mike.
Well, and you know, these corporations do great things. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of Apple.
Sure.
You know, but they should play fair too. And the only way to do any of these kind of tests and to look at how we're going to solve these problems is to have a system that actually works and isn't dysfunctional. And, you know, I mean, my own personal opinion is that a lot of these systems, they lack the feedback loops. You know, they were not designed to handle all of the things that they're being asked to do. And in a way, we're trying to rebuild the engine of the car while the car is in motion.
Right.
You know, and that's we're designing in production, to borrow, you know, my systems engineering background. It's a terrible way to build a system.
Right. No, I mean, when in terms of Apple, I was thinking, as I understand it, China is heavily investing in robotics, and that's the major part of their supply chain. So I don't know. It's interesting that this company that's so resistant to paying however much they pay in taxes, even though they want us to pay $600 for the new smartphone, is that I don't know. They seem to be on the front line of this automation issue, and I don't fault them for that. Just to be clear, I think any business that can benefit from automation should do so early and often. But I don't know. It's tricky considering the way that this problem came up about moving wealth around and avoiding tax schemes and other things that we might think to use as a redistributive form of dealing with this issue. But about redistribution, that seemed to be a central theme of the next question's problem, which was about economic inequality. So when I think about automation, one of the worries I have, even though I feel like I'm so worried about my critics now that I'm always talking about how much I like robots and automation. But when I think about automation, I think about the Gigafactory that's going to build a lot of Teslas, and Elon Musk is kind of bragging that could probably be fully automated by 2020. That a Tesla will never touch a human hand until they start test driving it and running it into walls for crash tests or whatever they do. But in my mind, that means all of the wealth is going to be heavily concentrated. So that's why I was kind of concerned about economic inequality. And there were a few comments in particular I want to bring up, but I wanted to pitch it to you guys. What do you think about automation and how its potential effects on economic inequality?
Well, I think because you're going to have large you're not going to be able to just go out and buy a robot and send it to work. I mean, that would be stupid. So companies are going to own the robots. They're going to be able to make the product for, nothing or whatever it is, a very small amount. So I think that you're going to see that as far as the corporations and there's going to be a smaller and smaller number of people who, if this all pans out the way we think, although technology never pans out the way we think.
Right. It's true. Yeah. Well, there were I will say Robin Hanson mentioned that there's really no reason to link these two issues. That we have an income inequality, a distribution problem already, regardless of whether how many robots are in the system. Although I do recall that McAfee and Brynjolfsson in the Second Machine Age point to the great decoupling, and they think that automation has a lot to do with this, about productivity on a very sharp curve going up, meanwhile earned wages staying the same. And I feel like the same would probably be true of a more automated economy. They blame automation for that, and some people have disputed that. I found it convincing because I'm biased. I'll be honest. But yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things about the distribution problem was comments from Garl Perovitz, who kind of suggested that tech is arguably something that that society, rather than particular individuals, have participated in creating and building on. So therefore, we should all benefit. I think he's trying to make the case for why there should be greater distribution of the wealth that's generated from a more automated economy. I guess the point being that Elon Musk didn't invent the independent circuit or electricity. So I don't know, how did that argument, I don't know if you guys read that particular comment, but how did that grab you? I thought it was probably the most controversial thing in this paper.
To me, there are a lot of parallels with the copyright debate, I guess. Copyright in a way is a lot of our shared cultural resources. The people that write books, they didn't invent the novel, they didn't invent English, and yet we still allow them a certain degree of a monopoly and the ability to profit off that, but it's in theory limited. And yet if you look at the history of copyright, really, particularly in the 20th century, it's kind of become unlimited, and it's benefited mostly corporations, a few
record companies,
wealthy authors, potentially, but for the most part, groups. And you take the music industry, there was a whole network of executives and agents and things like that that was supported by copyright. Well, meanwhile, the artists who actually did the work, really, they were getting pennies on the dollar, basically, for a lot of that material. I think that a lot of that it's almost mythologized in our culture. And, when you talk to people about copyright, they get very possessive. Well, if I created an idea, I'd want to profit off it. I'd want my kids to profit off it and their kids. But a lot of these same ideas come up, and I think there are a lot of parallels, because it is somewhat by virtue of being in society, you kind of benefit from these things. And I think that it's not bad to necessarily share a bit. Obviously there's always going to be some inequality in the distribution of these things. There's going to be some people who, really move the needle forward. I mean, I'm a big fan of Elon Musk. I love the Tesla. I love some of the things he's doing with the Hyperloop and, the power wall and all that. But,
right.
There are other problems in the world to solve that I don't think he's necessarily even aware of himself because, he lives in Silicon Valley. He's rich. He's got a hot wife and all that. And, that's a great life to have. Good for him. But there are some pretty big problems in the world still. And I'd like to see, some of those problems get addressed too for the rest of us.
Yeah. No, that's interesting.
Elon Musk wife.
I think he may be getting divorced now, but he's had several hot
wives,
actually.
Oh, I'm married. Yeah, keep forgetting about that.
And Matt has to hear me rant about copyright all the time, so he's probably sick of it.
Well, but basically, what it sounds like you're saying is we need to take a more generous approach, more of a marketplace view of these sorts of things, where if something is a public good, that it should be there for people to use and take to enhance progress.
I think there should be a component of that at least. Maybe not 100%, but at least some component that goes back to society. Because you got to remember, if you happen to be Elon Musk, for example, you benefited by being born into a society that allowed you the opportunity to become Elon Musk.
Sure.
And that's worth something right there. You should somewhat pay it back. And that includes maybe the people who weren't that lucky, who, ended up with a meth problem, living in a trailer park or wherever. And granted, maybe that person doesn't make the best life decisions. Sure. But,
I mean, yeah, you're right. If your success has had a lot to do with forms of social capital that you were born with, there really should be that attitude of sort of gratefulness and wanting to give back, but there often isn't.
Well, that's a hard concept, I think, for people to get because, everybody we're kind of designed to see it as fair that we get to keep as much as possible of what we do. And
and we also never think we have it easy. We also always think we're the ones who have it the hardest and that everyone else gets everything too easy anyway.
Well, and I'm all for people keeping what they actually develop, but
sure.
I think there should be a component of recognizing the benefits of being part of a society too.
Right.
It does remind me of like the in the 2012 election when Obama and Mitt Romney were sparring over the "you didn't build that" line, when Obama was mentioning like, there are all of these goods that are there are all these benefits reaped by businesses that, in the form of roads, public schools, and then Mitt Romney countered like, no, everything a businessman, or basically, I don't remember the details of this argument, but I just recall the "you didn't build that" controversy. But I think as you said, it goes beyond a distribution of wealth problem. It's about a distribution of opportunity. I was watching a video about automation, and there was someone that was like, no matter what we do, not everyone can be Mark Zuckerberg. Who we're going to let Zuckerberg stand in for Elon Musk for a moment. But
give Elon Musk a break.
But I don't know. There's a part of me that really hates that idea. Like I refuse to admit, like, why can't we all be entrepreneurs and creative people in whatever direction that takes us? It bothered me that this notion we can't all be Mark Zuckerberg. Because God damn it, I want everyone to be Mark Zuckerberg if they want to be. I don't know.
I would prefer not to be Mark Zuckerberg unless we could drop him well, not me.
We're talking about Mark Zuckerberg as a symbol here, Mike. Not. I mean, I don't want to be Mark Zuckerberg either.
I'm not really a fan of his work.
Well, I think we can kind of turn to the final point. Is that because we've received all these negative feedback about people assuming that we're against automation, or that we fear the consequences of a more automated economy, which we don't. I did want to let our commenters reply about what are the benefits of a more automated economy, and I guess I'll let you two dig into that, and I'll point to some of our authors in a minute.
My goal was to be one of those fat people in the floaty chairs at the vent end of Wall-E, and if the robots can make that happen, then
Yeah. I think that was kind of Robin Hansen's point, is that like he said again, this time isn't different. 2016 isn't different. This is that's his perspective. But he did say improved tech is what made us rich. We should keep using it to get richer. And I do in principle agree with that. I do suspect this time is different, again, mostly because I'm biased. I haven't done probably nearly as much reading as Robin has done, but I do get a sense that I always come back to Ned Ludd, the guy who was named after the Luddite movement, or the Luddite movement was named after him, who kind of started breaking, I believe, some sort of industrial textile technology.
I think it was a loom, wasn't it? Power loom?
Yeah, it was some sort of loom, yeah. And, even though we look back and we say that's really silly, there was never any threat for Ned Ludd about there being a loom that would learn. Machine learning, that was never something that Ned Ludd and that movement had to deal with. So I suspect that this time is different for that reason, because we're creating not just something that can do certain forms of labor, but can keep learning. I feel like that's what we're on the cusp of. Not in the next 10 years, but long term.
To me, the long-term answer to this question is exactly actually how our podcast got its name. And that's basically that the Robot Overlords is us somewhat, is that, we're going to merge with that technology, and become cyborgs somewhat, that the way that automation as a problem gets solved is that it becomes just literally an extension of us. And,
right.
We're all able to pursue more fully human lives. I mean, to me, that's the answer. That's the incredible opportunity of these kinds of technologies to allow people to become artists or, rock star, even if it's just sitting in your apartment, getting stoned and playing Rock Band. In your own head, you can be that rock god. Whatever we come up with, whether it's sitting in, your Wally floaty chair by the pool, and drinking your Big Gulp or whatever it was.
That's why I agree with you, and that's the big, the big post-labor, utopian future that automation offers. I always think, when I hear people talk about transhumanism, I always think, well, what about, we haven't reached humanism yet, really. So I mean, like we're already talking about going beyond humanism. I think we're still in a pre-humanist society. What do you guys think about that neat thing I just said?
I don't know where to begin, but
a lot of problems. Sorry.
Yeah.
Continue.
No, I mean, in a sense, I agree. I mean, we still fight over, whether it be religion or race. There's a lot of things we fight over that I think will only seem sillier and sillier as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But our lives are consumed with the kind of the unequivocal requirement that we produce, that we sell our labor, as you put it earlier, Mike.
Right.
And allowing us to either do that in a way that is meaningful to us and to no one else, perhaps. I think that's the freedom that automation could provide.
Well, and to me, this goes hand in hand with maybe the idea of moving out into space. I mean, you talk about Elon Musk, that seems to be one of his big goals. And I think one of the things that we're missing as a species right now is a frontier, a place for the people who are just fed up to go. I mean, if you look at, the history of Europe, a lot of what started, the current United States was people getting fed up and leaving and coming over here and trying something different. Right. And, obviously that had its own share of problems, but, I think we need that as a species, because when we're all cooped up, I mean, you look at all the different technologies that exist out there. I mean, there's still people that blacksmith. There's still people that are living in huts. There's still, tribes out there that basically are living in Stone Age kind of tech, except they've got a mobile phone. You've crammed all of this stuff together, and we don't get along. We need to be able to spread out again, because otherwise we're all going to go crazy. I mean, Matt and I were talking about a mutual acquaintance / friend before we joined you guys, and he's going to be spending a lot of time cooped up in a mobile home with his significant other, and you go crazy when you're cooped up with people you can't get away from. And in a lot of ways, I feel like the human race is hitting that point. We need a frontier again, and that's why I kind of applaud Elon Musk as opposed to Mark Zuckerberg. We need that.
I sort of agree with you that also, I mean, you're talking about lowering the human density, the physical human density, and sort of having this frontier as a release valve. But I think even symbolically, as a people, I think having a frontier gives you sort of a narrative. It gives you sort of a goal that you're working towards. It's you against the great beyond. And I think it's another thing we've lost. We sort of lost any sort of narrative as a people, and any sort of, I don't know, sort of that common shared goal.
Well, we're going a little long, so I think we'll conclude pretty soon. But I do want to mention that Manu Sadia's book, Trekonomics, he actually concludes in a way that kind of broke my heart, because he was, we've gone through him talking about economics in the context of the Starfleet Federation, and it kind of concludes like Spaceship Earth is probably where we're going to stay for the foreseeable future. And it kind of broke my heart a little bit, because I was like, we're never gonna meet a Ferengi. But at the same time, there are transhumanists that posit that virtual reality is the frontier, is the potential frontier where we can escape, which is an interesting idea. I'm not sure. I just feel like I'm jaded, because it's one of those things. Maybe like my grandchildren will embrace that idea. But for me, if I know it's not real, I probably will never think
that's
of
the
it as
thing.
a frontier.
What makes space such a great frontier is we're not in control of it. It's a true unknown. I feel like a poor frontier is something that we program in and say, hey, this is the thing I programmed. I'm experiencing it now. It's not really it's not really much of a frontier at that point. Yeah. It's got to be wild and untamed.
Have you guys been able to try VR?
I have never tried VR. No.
No, I haven't tried. Well, I mean, I've tried very poor VR in the past. Not this current generation.
He'll get really close to his smartphone and watch YouTube. That's what he does.
Yeah.
Oh, Matt could tell you about the experience of experiencing it recently for the first time.
Yeah,
really.
We've talked about this before, but it's one of those things where it sucks because you can't. It's not something you can like talk to somebody about and be like, oh, it's so cool. It's kind of like trying to describe a food that nobody's ever tasted before. And,
right.
Oh, it's so good. Oh my God. Because it's so much different than anything else you've ever experienced. So it's,
Well,
we're
getting off topic, but I have to ask: Were you able to suspend your belief or disbelief in this situation?
Suspend your disbelief.
I don't know which it would be, though, for virtual reality.
Suspend your disbelief.
Well, I mean, what Mike had, because he had stuff that was before the Oculus really came out.
Okay.
So it was a lot
of... It's the DK2.
Yeah, it was demo things, so it wasn't, like, ultra realistic or anything. But, he had a roller coaster, simulator, and I'll be honest, you get the stomach pains and the whole 9 yards from.
Well, I've been in the the ones you sit inside, that sort of thing. I mean, that's sort of a that has the screen and you feel like you're on a roller coaster. I mean, I've done that, and it is weird that no matter how much you tell yourself that it isn't real, like if you get enough senses involved in the experience. And I've had people talk about the Oculus and about how real it is, and I can tell it's a very profound level of reality that they're talking to me about.
The closest thing I've come to virtual reality is Time Cop or Time Crisis. I meant to say Time Crisis. Time Cop.
We used to stand in front of. Oh my God!
I ruined that joke by saying Time Cop, like the best JCVD movie. But
that's not saying a whole lot.
With that, I think we will conclude. It's been great talking with you guys today. I appreciate your feedback on all the stuff we're doing. Mike, I appreciate your contribution to this. We should do this again sometime. Can't thank you enough for coming on. Make sure, listeners, be sure to visit these guys at robotoverlords.fm. Check them out.
Yeah, that's Robot Overlords with a Z, too.
Yes. Yeah, important detail there. But thanks again, guys, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.